Here-
Well, hello there, and welcome to the Reiki Women podcast. My name is Carrie Varela, and it's always so wonderful to be joined in these podcasts with Bronwen Logan and Michaela Daystar. And this week, we are going to dive deep into a recent blog that Bronwen wrote called What Does It Mean to Be a Woman of Hara? And this is a really interesting topic. It has a lot of interlays with our Reiki Women podcasts. And so I'd like to turn it over to you, Bronwen. What does it mean to be a woman of Hara?
Yeah, well, just to begin with, it was actually inspired by all our chats and the just thinking about being a woman and, beginning these podcasts and having people say, oh, but, we weren't inclusive, or that, which is absolutely not what this is about at all. And that I really felt that, well, what does it mean being a woman? I wanted to give a voice to women because I felt there were so many women in the system of Reiki. And I'm right, because when I look at the data, it's over 80% of the practitioners, people who study the system of Reiki, are women. And yet we still tend to be in a more, I don't know how to say it, because I don't want to insult women in any sense, but it does sometimes feel that there's a slightly more submissive aspect to our voice. And I really wanted just women to be able to speak and say what they wanted to say. And I'd love your thoughts on it as well. Oh, and the other reason I wrote the article was I wanted to say the word clitoris. And I find on, now I've got to say it on a podcast, write it down on a Reiki webpage. No, that's a joke, by the way. It wasn't just to write the word clitoris or say the word clitoris.
That was like 45% of the point, right? Just 45%.
It was fun, though. It was fun. And the rest of it was just different things over the years that have come up, and then they just sort of come together. And I did notice that a few women said to me that they had definitely, that they teach that way, and that they thought that way. And I think that that's really beautiful. I love connecting into that, and it's great to be able to discuss things from a female perspective, so that we can maybe support the men in understanding what it means to be a woman as well. There's so much stuff in all of this, and it's all, like I said, all related to what we've been talking about in our podcasts. And sometimes we don't talk about women because it's also a podcast for everybody, but it is about women's voices. So of course we're allowed to talk about ourselves sometimes too. And the crux of the article was, just in case you hadn't read it, the crux of the article was that the Hara, which, we work with in the system of Reiki, is, below the belly button, inside the body. And it is this place of original energy, this energy that we're born with. And when we do our practices, the Japanese practices with the system of Reiki, we are nurturing, strengthening this energy. And it is also our energetic connection through to the earth, which is one of the foundation sort of elements that we work with the system of Reiki, when we work with the earth and the heavens, and then coming together and then creating this whole complete us at the center. So the Hara is incredibly important for us. It's always the first port of call. It's foundational. And a lot of the stuff that I had read about or had been taught, well, it was never very clear to me where the Hara was, and which is fine, because I think it's an experiential thing, right? But then on the other hand, I did read very prescriptive things. So, I can't remember the exact amount, but there was something that was like 9.2 centimeters below the belly button, and, really prescriptive things. And yet each one's slightly different. And I was trying to work that one out in my head. And then some male writer that I was reading, a key practitioner, he said that, he wondered as a Westerner whether it would be different for him where the Hara was, in contrast to someone who was Japanese. And that might well be the case because, maybe he's a very tall Westerner, and maybe Japanese people, generally, were, I think that's changing, but shorter, so where that would sit in the body would be different. And I thought, yeah, but hey, what about me? I'm a woman. I'm actually different to both of you, so just trying to find out what this might mean for me. And I know that it's through experience that we find out where the Hara is, but I did make a connection. And I made a connection to something that happened in my life that gave me a better understanding of my body physically. And that was giving birth, which then linked into this whole idea that we, as a woman, giving birth, if that's related to the Hara and this idea of original energy, it feels very matrilineal, actually. This passing down of energy through the ages. I've probably got a lot more to say on that, but I'm just going to hand it over. So go, guys.
I love it. I love the enthusiasm that's just like bubbling forward from you, Bronwen. And I loved this article. I immediately proposed that we talk about it on the podcast. A lot of it resonated with my own experience and questions that I've had. And experiences that I've had both personally and with clients. One of the things that came up for me was the work that I've done with pregnant folks and with maternity Reiki services and classes. I occasionally teach a maternity Reiki class. And, a significant part of that class is, utilizing practices like Joshin Kokyu-ho, modifying it in certain ways, specifically for connection between, the parent and the unborn child. And right away, this connection between the physical location of the Hara and where the baby is situated in the body, was obvious. I think that it was funny reading the part about, the specific numbers of centimeters, because immediately I'm like, but people's bodies are proportioned differently. However, it is intriguing to think about the belly button as that point of measuring.
Yeah.
Because in a certain sense, we all have a belly button. It is in a particular place in our body. And if we say that the Hara is in relationship to the belly button by a certain distance, then, that there might not be a whole lot of variation from body to body, but you still land essentially at the womb space for a person's body that is carrying a womb, regardless of their gender identity. If there's a physical uterus there, it's basically in the location that the Hara is being described at. And so if there's a baby growing there, right, what is the implication of this new life, right? This spark of life. Whenever I lead Joshin Kokyu-ho, I refer to the light, that clear, bright, luminous spark in the Hara as a spark of life. If there's literally a life growing at that location, right? Yeah. My spark of life is there, shining in all directions. There's a whole new life, a whole new being that is also there, growing in all directions, with their own little spark of light that's developing in their Hara. There's just so many layers of wonderful imagery, and it's just such an incredibly fertile, pun intended, entry point into a Reiki session. So I've had really, really powerful sessions with people who are pregnant, walking through that exploration of both the spiritual and physical anatomy that is related to the Hara. And the other thing that comes up for me related to that is, again, back to the belly button. Because what is the belly button? The belly button is the physical mark, right? It's the scar or the physical, mark that we carry from that connection to our mother. It's the place on our body where we can see without any doubt that we were connected from the center of our body to the center of her body. And, for the Hara to be in direct relationship to that point of connection with our birthing parent is, again, so layered with meaning and with power. When we think about the connections of bodies in relationship to the connections of spirit, that there's this blending, there's this powerful relationship between our physical bodies and our spiritual bodies, our mental bodies, our energy bodies, which of course is a huge theme in how we explore Reiki from the perspective of its origins. And so when we think about the particularities of a female body with respect to the Hara, there's all these layers of meaning that exist there, that are not better than a body that is not female body, but different, particular. There's a particularity of seeing those layers of connection between the physical body and the energetic body with respect to the Hara. And it was very exciting to see you break that down and talk about it in that blog article. And for those of you who have not yet checked it out, please do. And I recommend you play the audio version where you get to hear Bronwen reading it to you. It's very we will link it down below.
I'll let you read to me anytime, Bronwen. I love your voice. So beautiful. Yeah, so I think obviously if you haven't read it already, pause this recording and then read it, listen to it, and I think our discussion will be more meaningful. But first of all, I want to acknowledge, both of you, because I feel like every time we do this podcast, I learn something. I learn something from Michaela. I learn something from Bronwen. It's always so much learning that's happening. But I did not know that snakes had clitorises. And so I learned so amazing from this article. And I'm so glad that we brought the clitoris into the Reiki Women podcast. Had a little chat about it.
It feels like it's been a long time coming.
Yeah,
like, why haven't we gone there before?
Over a year now, guys.
Over a year. We haven't talked about clitorises even at all.
Not even once. But breaking the seal today. So it's pretty amazing. Groundbreaking, really. But what I love about the article as well is just that you're pointing out to, I think, a big inequality in our world and our society, is that women's health and women's issues, even women's spirituality, are always seen second to men. That so much of the languaging in spirituality and in medicine as well is really based on male archetypes of male bodies, and there's not a whole lot of care to be inclusive with women as well. And we know, so many of women's health struggles. That's what kind of brought up for me. It's just how many women's health struggles have been totally ignored in medicine. They've been women who've experienced extreme pain. Like I don't know how many women I know who have endometriosis, fibroids, and other reproductive health issues. And the pain associated with so many of those disorders is profound and incredibly impactful on those kinds of women's lives. And so little is known about it, and so little treatment is available. It's really unfortunate. And so this whole idea of kind of patriarchal norms and narratives within spirituality has been really up for me lately too. And I just was organically thinking about it because I've been doing a lot of research and teaching a Shinpuden course recently, and a lot of the research that I've been doing is around detachment and non-duality, especially around non-attachment and some of those principles within Buddhism. And that always kind of rubs me a little bit the wrong way. I do believe in non-attachment. I think it's really important. Yet I think it's also kind of a masculine archetype of that can be built upon trauma, where somebody doesn't feel comfortable or doesn't have the emotional capacity to really connect with somebody
Yeah.
else. And so it's almost easier emotionally, energetically to go towards this place of non-attachment. Um, and I think that everything is in balance, right? There's non-attachment is medicine until it's poison, and vice versa. So there's a healthy amount of non-attachment and detachment, but there's also a healthy amount of interconnection. And that's what I feel like is a more divine feminine archetype, and that women have to be in a role of
Mm.
interdependence and interconnection, not only in our families, but with the roles that we typically play in motherhood, and rearing children and so forth. But also, it's like it feels like something more awake within relationships and marriage, that I think of myself as somebody reaching out for connection. And sometimes there's a capacity to reach back, and sometimes there's not. Um, and So I think about, and I think of the role of detachment as, a monk or a nun, you know, detaching all the way from the world, but for what aim?
Yeah.
And so I think more about this divine feminine characteristic. How can we bring that back into the conversation as well? Because the opposite, the non-dual aspect of that is non-attachment and also interconnection. So where do we come back together? Is that a divine feminine thing, or is it present in all of us? But we have to name um, these norms that tend to get shadowed by patriarchal ways of talking and being. So I think it's really important to bring up these subjects and to normalize these conversations, not just amongst women, but also amongst men and women.
Yeah.
And to not put women in subjective supportive roles, but making space for women to step into roles of leadership. And that's really, I think, the essence of our podcast, is that what we really wanted to get across was to amplify women's voices, and to highlight women who are taking roles of leadership in spiritual circles, because a lot of times men tend to hold roles of leadership in spiritual circles, even if the ratio is 80% men or 80% women and 20% men. Just easier to put men in those leadership roles, and so some of that is an inner working of allowing ourselves to be put into leadership roles and feeling strong and capable to step into those places. Um, but we also need, a narrative around men allowing that as well.
Yeah.
So
Carrie, there's so much in what you just said. Oh my goodness, right? I know. I think we need a different podcast. It's just like there is so much material there just to think about and talk about, isn't there? Oh, wow. Yeah. And, just your last point, I'll go from one end to the other, but from, just your last point, like I know so many beautiful men, right? And this is the thing. It's not about being horrible to men or saying that they're not even being negative about men, but it is understanding that even the most loveliest of men has grown up as a man, and so they've grown up in a certain place, and it's really hard to see outside that space. And I know that because it's the same for me as a white woman in another world, for someone else who's very different for me, it's very hard for us to see outside our own worlds. And no matter how hard we try to be as open and work with that, we are still to some extent within the constraints of our upbringing in society, our cultural understandings. And it just is that way. And it's wonderful that we're all working at trying to be more open and more understanding of each other. And I appreciate that, and I appreciate the many wonderful men who also are trying to do that too. But then there's also the men who don't bother to look outside themselves, or what you were just saying about attachment and, monks and nuns, and I get all that. And there's two voices going in my head. I can hear the voice saying, oh no, Carrie, because they're doing it for everybody, right? They're not just doing it for themselves, right? That's the sort of one voice. Yep. And then the other voice saying, I know exactly what you mean, Carrie, and in India, they call people who aren't monks and nuns, they call them householders. Yeah. But you can be a spiritual householder. So you can be someone who has a family and all of that, and yet you have a very deep spiritual self. And that in many ways is harder because the whole world is there, with all the stuff that goes on. But on the other hand, it's beautiful because the challenges that brings us, being in life. Actually, I just wrote an article about nature called True Nature, if we're talking about articles, and, being in nature, of nature, being, we're of this world. We are a part of this world. So all the challenges that are there, if we take ourselves away from that, maybe we think there are some shortcuts doing that, but being in it, when we have all those challenges that come to us, then it helps us to grow, to be better people, to, be more open, loving, if that's what we choose. So I think being a householder is an amazing, wonderful thing. And we can see that within, if you like, the divine feminine, because women do tend to, that was the other thing that you said, oh my God, so much stuff. But like when I was with the International House of Reiki, people would say, oh, you're such a great rock. You're a rock. And I'm like, I don't want to fucking be a rock. Right? Look, I've got nothing against rocks, honestly. I think rocks are a wonderful part of nature, but I don't really want to be a rock. I want to be me. And it's putting me into this space that actually I don't belong. And it's exactly what you were saying, Carrie, and about what we do to women, and these places where we place them. And it was meant as something to be a positive thing, and I appreciate that. But I'm just saying that for myself, it didn't feel right, to be this solid little thing.
Running everything else, but not shining yourself.
But yeah. Oh, look, one more thing. I was just thinking about the divine feminine. If we look at the system of Reiki, and we look at, I've just been, doing some more work with the Shinto stuff, and the Shinto goddess, Amaterasu, she is the original creator of the everything in that sense. She is the head of all the kami, or the gods, if you like, the spirits. And within Shintoism and within many shamanistic practices, it is the female that is the healer, the creator. There's so much beautiful depth of wisdom and knowledge that we can draw on as women. And I love that. I think that's so beautiful. And it's something that, I would love to see more thought about in the system of Reiki. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much here. And I feel like there's a couple other podcast discussions that are going to branch out of here. There's two or three responses in particular that are sitting with me, and both of them are a little complex. So one of them is related to what you were sharing about non-attachment, and the other is related to this idea of divine energies. And I think I'm going to begin there. I was actually having a conversation with one of my students this morning about this very thing, and we were talking about the ways in which our understandings of things like gender, like physical sex, and like energies has come to such a greater place of understanding and a greater space of conversation publicly about these things many times these conversations can be challenging. They can get awkward. They can, they're challenging the way that we think about things we thought we understood, like gender and sex and gender identities. And I think that's a really amazing place to be. It's a challenging place to be, but it's a really amazing place to be. And one of the things we were talking about was the fact that, our physical bodies have particularities about them. And there's certain experiences that are often shared by people whose bodies have similarities. For example, having a female body or a male body. And there are energies, like you mentioned, the divine feminine, the divine masculine, masculine, feminine energies that exist in all people to certain degrees, regardless of their body.
Yeah.
And that when we're looking at, balancing our societies in ways where people really get to step into the fullness of themselves that you were just speaking to, Bronwen, and also the various needs of society are getting met, we're looking at really honoring the ways in which those energies show up in each individual person. So, for example, I've worked with birthing people who are physically female but do not identify as female. So they're giving birth, they're pregnant, they're carrying a child, they have a womb, a uterus. We're doing that beautiful meditation where we're sitting in the hara and also sitting in the uterus. They themselves do not identify as a woman. I think it's a really powerful place to be, because there's this particularity of experience that client has that's different than me in many ways, and also that's shared with me in certain ways. And so when we talk about being a woman of Hara, we might be talking about a person who has a uterus and the Hara is nestled right in there in that physical location. We might be talking about somebody who does not have a uterus, but really embodies a feminine energy and takes that on as part of their identity. We might be talking about somebody who has that uterus and doesn't take on femininity as their identity, right? There's all of these different ways that might show up. And I think that, it's so important for us as a society and us on this podcast to be able to give space for all to explore all of those particularities. Of course, we're going to speak from our own experience. I am a cisgendered woman. I have a physical body that is female. I identify as female. There's alignment there in a certain way that's particular to me and to others. And, I've given birth, so I have that experience. And again, it was, really an honor to work with a client who was giving birth who did not identify the same way that I do. And so when we think about, the experience of being a woman of Hara, how does the energy and how does the relationship that we have to the Hara get filtered through our own particular experience? And then what pieces of that are universal? Because really what we're doing when we're paying attention to the Hara, when we're getting into that spark of life, is we're paying attention to the interconnected sameness, oneness of life. And so we get to speak from both of those experiences. And part of, this is going to bridge to the piece around non-duality and around non-attachment, is that what we're really working towards, at least for me, this is one way that I understand my Reiki practice, is I'm working towards being able to hold, beautifully at the same time, in a way that doesn't feel separated, the relative reality of my particular body walking through the world in my life and the experiences I have had, and the ultimate reality of myself as a drop of life in this ocean of life that's all the same. And that we get to explore that intersectionness. And for me, non-attachment is essential in that. And I think, Carrie, to what you were saying, you were really speaking to, in really a heartbreaking way for me, one of the ways in which our Western mind misunderstands these concepts. Because the way that you were speaking about non-attachment as a reflection of trauma, as a reflection of, as a reflective response to trauma, meaning I'm going to disconnect, right? When I heard you talking about it, describing it, what I heard was, this is the description of disconnection or dissociation. I have been harmed, and the strategy that I'm going to use to not feel that harm is to disconnect and to dissociate. And in a way, that disconnection from life, from other people, is actually a form of attachment to my trauma. right? So I am attached to the fear, to the anger, to the suffering, to the pain, to the wrongdoings that I am carrying because of traumatic experiences. And that part of my practice of Reiki and working with the concept of non-attachment has involved learning to let go of my attachment to the fear, to the anger, to the pain, to the suffering, to the resentment of things that have traumatized me in the past. And as I become unattached to those things and let my body release them, I can actually lean into interconnection more strongly. I can feel my connection to all of life because I'm no longer pushing away and dissociating and disconnecting from the people who hurt me. I'm able to allow that into my field of connection because at the level of ultimate reality, it doesn't matter that they hurt me because we have a hara to hara connection. That's what we have with all of life. That's where our connection to all of life lives. And so non-attachment and interconnection are absolutely connected, just like the divine feminine and the divine masculine are interconnected inside of our life. And the thing that I want to just kind of close this loop of thoughts with something else that's been really present with me for the last few days, since it came up in a class, in my Shodan class that I was just, we just had our final of 8 classes. So we did this really beautiful closing ceremony. And so much of what was shared from my students brought forward this quote from Martin Luther King about the relationship between love and power. And I feel like it's related to what we're saying here. And so I want to just share it. King says that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. And I think you could play with inserting feminine and masculine in there with power and love. Not maybe a one-to-one in this quote, but the idea that all feminine without masculine could be sentimental and anemic, and all masculine with no feminine, could be reckless and abusive. And that they have to be in balance, not only in us as an individual, but in society, in the balance of our communities. We need women and men of Hara. We need people of Hara to have that balance inside of us so that we can fill the roles of society in ways that are balanced and healthy and loving. And that we need both of them in our lives to a certain extent. I actually set the word power as my word for the year, which I've never done before. Pick a word for the year. This is a thing people do. This is my word for 2023. I've never done that before, but for some reason I did do that this year. And the word that came forward was power. And what I realized is that I lean too far sometimes into the feminine, into the soft, into the love, into the soft and gooey places. And that I actually needed to bring the masculine. I needed to bring power into my life so that I could get some things done. I could find that rock, right? Like that I was missing in certain ways. So anyway, that was a lot, but I love that the discussion of non-attachment and the discussion of gender inside of our practices and experiences and this idea of being a woman of Hara came together in this conversation. And I'd love to explore non-attachment more in another conversation.
Yeah, interesting.
I'm really grateful, Michaela, that you brought up that distinction because I think it is really important. I think that there's so much health in non-attachment, but we have to also investigate our motives there. And so that's really what I was trying to say. And I think you captured that beautifully and spoke to that dilemma in some ways, right? Is how can we see them from that non-dualistic way of being, because the other side of the coin is interconnection.
And how can we not use terms and perspectives and beliefs from other cultures to justify our own traumatic responses, right? Like, I think that's part of what you were speaking to is like, I can be, I'm in non-attachment. I'm such a good Buddhist, but actually I just don't want to deal with people.
But it doesn't
actually, I just don't want to work through my stuff,
But it doesn't even need to come from another culture. But yes.
In this case, if I'm an American, And I'm saying, oh, I'm going to take on this Buddhist concept of non-attachment, but really what I'm doing is dissociating. Then we have a problem.
It's the same with the system of Reiki, the misuse of the well, I mean, that's one aspect of it, exactly what you're saying, the misuse of the precepts. Yeah. People using the precepts against other people. I mean, what the hell is that? It's sort of like the opposite of what the precepts are about, right? They're a practice for us. And that is that not wanting to actually look at those precepts, but really pushing them out there. And you'll often see people saying, oh, you need to be more, and start preaching the precepts, and then it turns into a dogma, into a religion, which it's not. It's a personal practice.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we can, well, there's just a lot to this topic, but, it's important to, and I love what you were saying, Michaela, basically is, how I would summarize that is, it's oppressive to all genders. It's oppressive to men and women and people who identify as neither one or both. The 6 different genders, anatomical genders that we have, in the rainbow of the human race. So when we do this work to undo some of the patriarchy, it leaves more space for not just women to step into roles of leadership and power, but for all of us to be our true self, because the patriarchy is just as damaging to men as it is to women.
Yeah.
And and to people who don't identify within those gender constraints. So yet, our podcast is still about, representing women and women's voices and women's perspectives, and recognizing that within that complexity, men might embody different aspects of feminine identity, of feminine wisdom. And likewise, women can embody different aspects of divine masculine energy, wisdom. And I think looking through the lens of gratitude, I'm grateful that we do have a much more mobile and fluid society than even just 20 years, 40 years back, generations back. So I think things are changing, and I know I see it at my kids' school. I don't know how many men are dropping off their kids, and how many families I know that men are the primary caregivers for their children. So we know that those gender identities are shifting, and I really feel like this is, and it's confined within Reiki, and it's an important topic within Reiki because it allows us to embody our true self and to, be that person, maybe blurring outside the lines, and to feel confident doing that. And I think of that as kind of Reiki in action, Reiki in those bigger waves, beyond our own personal practice into societal change. I also think, though, it's beautiful to just center the hara in the center of the uterus. I mean, why not? Coming back to that whole concept. And there was a yogic meditation that one of my yoga teachers guided me through a while back. And we walked ourselves back through the different layers of time, millions of years, and we just sat inside of the space of the Milky Way, the space of our solar system, the space of the earth before it was created. And we just felt this throbbing, pulsing potentiality. And that's the essence, I think, of what we capture inside of the uterus, and we capture in the hara, is that we're back into this like primordial awareness of the universe and creation constantly moving us forward. There's a really interesting article recently I read, or not article, but fun fact is that, when we are in our mother's uterus and in utero, that egg that was us was actually sparked in our mother's mother. So when we're in utero, that's when our eggs are born as well. And so that there's this connection all the way through our grandmother, of that jumping of generation and generation. And so my daughter's eggs are her grandchildren are already there, and they were formed in my uterus. And so wow, there's just so much to think about, so much to be with in that space. So I'd love to hear your final thoughts.
Yeah, well, that's so beautiful to see it in that light, and I love that idea of that that connection that we have backwards, in to where we came from and how we're here. It's so beautiful. Anyway, yeah, I mean, I could have written an article that says, what was it? I can't even think what the topic was. Being a woman of Hara, something like that. So, I mean, it could have been, being a person of Hara. But there was a reason for it being about women. And, I sort of explained a little bit in the beginning about that, we, it's about raising our voices and being seen and heard, and which is something that has not been the case in our society for a very long time. And yes, things are changing, and this is a part of that. We are a part of that. So I'm very grateful to you guys and the people listening for being a part of that too. Yes, as a woman, I mean, it's such an interesting thing, Michaela, bringing that up. I think that we and Carrie too, talking about, that rainbow of being a human. And, we are so definitive on this male and female thing sometimes. And they are definitely this concept of this dualness, and this dualness coming together into a wholeness. And it's because when we become whole, perhaps it becomes less important whether we are men or women, right? So, and then, I feel for all the people who, within all of that, there's this feeling like, for example, people that are born as men and yet feel like women, and have that sense. My own child is non-binary. I definitely, I see something in the future in that. And it's not something I've ever spoken to my child about, because I'm letting that person do their own thing in their own life. But I see this future of, it is almost like a blending of everything into one in one person. And it's a very, it's a creative, whole experience. And I don't know where that's going in our world, but it is an interesting place to think about, and to think about who we are, and how sometimes our definitions and our labels of ourselves can be quite limiting as well. And that maybe that, I don't know, maybe sometimes our practice is also about releasing those things. Yeah.
And it's
So yeah, go.
It's just so lovely and such a gift to us that we have this practice that allows us to make room inside of ourselves for things that might otherwise feel like they're in conflict, right? So that we can make space for that oneness that you're describing. And at the same time, we can talk about our particular experiences in the body that we have, right? Like we can have room for all of that inside of our one little sovereign self. And I love that. That's one of the things that feels like an absolute gift from practicing Reiki, is that I feel so much more relaxed around holding things that for many other people feel very much in conflict with each other. Yeah.
And I feel like one other thing we haven't mentioned is like the location of the prostate gland is also really also in this area. And so there's some seeds that of that same creative energy in this, and that isn't necessarily confined to one gender. Maybe it's just this primordial pulsing creative energy that we both, both genders
Yeah.
embody.
Something about that location, right? The physical center of the body, right? Like that's where these generative, creative organs and feelings and energies just show up in all of us, that it looks differently, but like the feeling of it is so connected and so related. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we'd love to hear from you all. What are your thoughts and experiences as a woman of Hara? What are your thoughts on both our podcast topic today and Bronwen's amazing blog article? Always your thoughts are so informative for us. We love hearing from you. So please feel free to comment on any of our posts where you see this episode. Please also feel free to share this episode with somebody who you think would really enjoy it, could experience something from it. And we just appreciate you all so much for listening in to these weekly conversations. We hope they benefit you. And we're really excited for our opportunity to take these topics into practice. And so that's happening next month. Is it April 5th?
April 2nd. Yeah. At least here in America, it is April 2nd, April 3rd, I believe, in Australia.
Yeah. And Michaela will be running it. So you get to see that wonderful woman doing a thing.
I think, well, we're all talking about topics from this month. So perhaps, Michaela, it's up to you. She is the creatrix over there, but she will be including some of these topics that we've read in for the next 4 weeks into her practice circle. So breaking ground, offering these practice circles, and really just can't wait to
Will we be finding the clitoris, Michaela?
You'll have to come and find out for yourself.
Sorry, it just came into my head.
Well, it's been an awesome conversation with you all, and we look forward to speaking with you on future episodes, sharing a little bit more about how these practices come alive in our minds, our hearts, and society. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Should have been the G spot, shouldn't it? What am I saying? I'm confused.